I think just to maybe it helps for me to explain what I mean by a complex task. I'm trying to argue for two opposing propositions at two different levels. On the one hand, I'm going to argue that there is, in fact, tremendous synergy and interdependence, mutual reinforcement of human rights and religion at large. But that possibility, inspiring and necessary as it may be, is not quite true about religions as we have them now. So that's why I'm saying that we need to have a shift in paradigm both for religion and for human rights. And then I'm going to talk about Islam specifically in relation to human rights. So that's why I think the task is complex. And by trying to explain it in that way, I hope you can bear with me and also maybe better follow what I'm saying. I would start on the human rights side to begin with, because I think this morning we had very powerful and very inspiring presentations and really very, very moving. But naturally enough, I think for all the speakers, the assumption seemed to have been that we have an established normative consensus about human rights, against which various types of groups are not measuring up or not doing the right thing or doing the right thing, as the case may be. And also that it was very specific to the United States, which of course also is welcome, really desperately welcome. So in that sense, I wish many people around the world could have heard or listened to those presentations, because often the perception is that Americans don't care, they are not really engaged. They are in fact engaged, not all of them, not most of them probably, but some significant numbers are at least. But the point is that that assumption about normative consensus seem to have been taken for granted, not argued for, and I hope it was true. I wish it was true, rather, but I think we have to do some work to make it so, that we cannot take it for granted that there is a normative consensus about human rights. And also that there are some problems with the human rights regime that we have, normatively and institutionally, that make it less of a candidate for the normative consensus that we need to have, which is a real problem, because it doesn't mean that we have to start over, but I think we have to start with a very critical view of the current human rights regime, and normatively and institutionally. And I will speak a little bit about that as well. So I think that the reason why I think the current regime is not really quite up to the task is because human rights, as we have it in the declaration and the idea itself, the concept, is a radical and subversive idea. And if we do not pursue it in that mode of radical subversion, then we are not doing it justice. And what we are working with is not human rights, really. And I will try to explain why. So I think that what I actually have it here in my notes, I said that as if we are trying to go to the moon in a balloon, that we aim very high, but our method, our conceptual and institutional methods are inappropriate, to say the least. So I think that we need to pursue that radical purpose, because the idea of human rights as universal, which they have to be, if you are talking about human rights, they have to be universal. If they are universal, then they are the rights of every single person as a person, regardless of citizenship or membership of any class or group or sex or gender and so on. That's a very radical proposition and a very challenging proposition to every society, including this one, of course, and every other society. So it is a radical, challenging proposition if we take it fully seriously. And also when you talk about religion, I think also that you find also similar problems. I will come to that. But let me move on with the human rights briefly. Some of the challenges, of course, are to do with the idea of universality itself as a paradox. Because how can we have universal consensus on rights despite permanent and profound difference among human societies and cultures and religions and so on? So difference is permanent. There will never be a time when there is no difference among human beings, and with all the varieties of that difference. At the same time, the idea of universality of the rights of the human have to be on the same set of standards and norms for every person, and how can you reconcile the two? At this point, we think we have them reconciled by suppressing most voices and projecting one voice as the universal voice. And that is wrong, and it's not going to go anywhere. And I will maybe come to briefly, by that I mean the Western liberal voice. That is what human rights are presented in, and that is not going to fly, not to the moon or next door even. But let me move, sort of not to go ahead of myself here. The second paradox is what I call the paradox of self-regulation by the state. That the nature of the human rights paradigm is such that it is state-centric because it is founded and dependent on international law for the legality and binding nature of its norms and the nature of its institutions. And states are not going to enforce human rights effectively against themselves. Stand to reason that the states cannot be trusted to protect human rights against themselves, and yet, and maybe that's why and where the work of this new initiative might come, we might find ways of trying to make states do what they have to do, but not really to expect them to do it on their own. And by that I mean any state, every state, always, everywhere, not just simply places like Sudan, where I come from, and so on. Now, there are some practical, also operational difficulties. There is the point about the fundraising and the paradox is simply that to do human rights scholarship, to do human rights activism, we need funding. We have to go to the funding to the same people that we need to subvert and undermine in our human rights work. When we do this dance, and I did it myself, I did it for a long time, of trying to get funding to do the work that you need to do in order to undermine the people that are giving you the funding without appearing to be undermining them. That is a difficulty, I think. And maybe that's why we need religion, as I will come later on to explain. Then there is what I call human rights dependency. There was a time when I was director of Africa Watch, which is part of Human Rights Watch, before it became fully integrated in human rights. So I did that international human rights advocacy. I have a long experience with Amnesty International since I was in Sudan in the 80s and before that, 70s even. So I respect and understand the work they do, but the problem with it is that it perpetuates a human rights dependency. And let me explain briefly. By that I mean that northern human rights international organizations set the agenda for human rights that they deem to be relevant and necessary, investigate those human rights in developing countries in order to come back and report in developed countries for so-called donor governments to pressure offending governments in the South to protect the rights of people in the South. So people in the South, if they get any level of protection, they are not going to get it as subjects of human rights. They are going to get it as beneficiaries of human rights agenda that are set by northern organizations who are funded by the same corporations who are creating the human rights problems in the South to begin with. And also that the fact that the governments of the South, of post-colonial societies in Africa and Asia and Latin America are still so dependent on Western former colonial powers that they are forced or intimidated by them to protect human rights, they would not do otherwise, perpetuates and legitimates the very fact of state dependency of former colonial powers. So we tend to overlook the fact that why would Egypt or Kenya or anywhere else like that be responsive to European pressure? Because it's dependent on European aid and European technical assistance and so on. So we tend to overlook the fact that the post-colonial dependency continues because somehow it is used to protect human rights. And by the way, it does not. The human rights that are monitored and the human rights that are protested are not really the rights of the masses of the vast majority of people in the South or in developing countries. They are rights of other elites contesting political power. So, but we tend to assume that those are the rights that count, and then we tend to assume that if we pressure a government to pass a law or to make a declaration or to sign a treaty, we can sit back and relax because the human rights have been protected. And of course, it is not that simple, and it is never going to be through external agency of anybody, if it's not the agency of the people themselves. So out of those very sketchy remarks, I would like to go on to what I mean by shifting the paradigm in human rights. Why I said that to begin with, I mean that the project we have now is not quite really going to take us far. Now let me ask a series of questions. When we say human rights, who is the human in human rights? If it is a self-determining human, then every single human being has the right to define his or her own rights and cannot be forced or required to accept anybody else's definition, because that will undermine the very idea of the agency and self-determination of the person. So that's why the universality paradox is really so serious and fundamental, because if we take human rights seriously, we would not accept imposing our understanding of them on anybody else, or accept anybody else's imposing their understanding on us. And again, when we say what is the right in human rights, and we find that whereas the notion of the human is self-determining human, but of the north, not of the globe. The human in the Universal Declaration is not a universal human. It's a human of North Atlantic, imaginary, not a truly global human. And the problem with the notion of rights is that if it's a liberal notion of rights, then it's not going to go far in most, really, if you think about it globally, the vast majority of human societies. Let me just put it bluntly. As human rights sort of writing in the field and advocacy and all that, we value justiciability. And we seem to think, because that's part of the liberal notion of rights, that if a right is not justiciable, then it is not really a right. But in fact, to me, justiciability is bad for human rights, not good for human rights, because it shifts our attention and energy from pursuing human rights as a political project into pursuing legalistic enforcement that is not going to go far in most places where we need human rights the most. Justiciability is expensive, it's reactive, it can only happen after the fact. It can only target a particular specific violation by a particular specific individual to ultimately, several years down the road, thousands of dollars is spent to have that person convicted of a war crime and so on. But in the meantime, the vast majority of people in those countries themselves are not getting any human rights protection. I mean, I come from Sudan, and maybe it was mentioned in the bio piece. Al-Bashir, now we're spending so much effort and energy in prosecuting al-Bashir before the ICC and doing this and not doing that. But in the meantime, a lot of very fundamental, serious human rights work is not being done. in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, in terms of basic development, in terms of fundamental security for most people. And the notion of justiciability, I am from Sudan, I traveled in Darfur, in other regions. I lived in Sudan until I was 40. How old am I now? So the thing is that you travel for days, you will not encounter a single policeman, let alone a court and a judge and an attorney and all of that. So simply there is no infrastructure to pursue justiciability in the vast majority of places where we need protection of human rights the most. Those are some of the problems, and therefore the shifting of the paradigm have to be in terms of those types of difficulties. That we have to find a way of taking human rights. The legal part may, if as far as it can take us, but it has to be more fundamentally political. And it has to be more fundamentally, personally challenging to each and every one of us. Personally. If we maintain our lifestyle, if we maintain our sort of attitudes to issues and what we do with our days and our time, our money, our energy, we are not going to do anything really to protect human rights as they ought to be protected. It's not going to happen. Where are that you need really a very, very fundamental shake-up of people's attitudes and practices and behavior. I always say that human rights are really about the way that you treat your child, your wife, your neighbor on the street. If there is no human rights in our communities, there is not going to be human rights anywhere else. Where are they going to come from? So it is immediately interpersonal, immediately sort of at every interaction we have on the street, in our neighborhoods, our work, and so on. Now, for those types of critiques and problems, I suggest that religion is probably for believers, of course. I mean, I'm not talking about people who are not believers in religion, but for those who are believers in religion, that religion in particular probably is the most likely force that can transform their attitudes to life and lifestyle and behavior. So the sort of change we need to have in each one of us is the sort of change that religion is more likely to motivate and drive and sustain more than any other ideology or other philosophy. That in the histories of our religion we have seen experiences, in the contemporary practices, despite the problem I'm going to come to in a minute, religion is that type of force that can actually drive sort of altruistic, selfless, sacrificial type of engagement and willingness to really challenge yourself and bring the best out of yourself and so on. So for that, I'm suggesting that religion, at this point, I'm just leaving it vague, like that. Religion is capable of doing that. Whether any religion is now doing that or not, I doubt. But as a proposition, that's what I see as likely or probably to work. Now, as soon as we talk about religion or human rights, immediately people worry about any connection between religion and politics. And of course, for good reason. There are problems with really even the concept of religion, or any religion in particular. Whether Islam, Christianity, or any religion. There is a problem with the very idea of religious affiliation because it tends to be exclusive to a moral community. And a fundamental challenge to all religions is how do you keep moral exclusivity while accepting and practicing political and economic and social inclusivity. So there is really good reason to worry about religion, but the problem is it's already in politics. So people who say, but we don't want a connection between religion and politics, well, with all due respect, it is connected everywhere. The fact that you don't know it even is a bigger problem. There is no society where people who are believers do not act politically as believers, or that their religious beliefs does not affect their political behavior. And we have many examples of this. In this country, I noticed since I came to live here about 20 years or so now, that people tend to think of separation of religion and the state as if it means the same thing as separation between religion and politics. And it does not. The state and politics is a different proposition than state and religion. So religion and politics, I mean, is a different proposition. And then, therefore, that is, my answer would be, yes, we need to separate religion from politics from the state institutionally, but it is not possible to separate religion from politics. Therefore, we need to regulate the relationship between religion and politics in a way that safeguards the separation of religion and the state. But not to assume that by separating religion and the state, we are achieving the other of separation of religion and politics. There are ways in which that we have found ways of trying to combat and to contain or to limit the damage that the problem or the difficulty of religion in the public space has caused. And in this country has a good record of that. I mean, you have a very rich jurisprudence of the First Amendment, which tries to do the same, to safeguard religious public presence of religion, while at the same time, or by the disestablishment at the same time, by limiting the connection or between religion and the state. So I think we have to continue with the. So my answer to the fears, which I said are real, is not really quite satisfactory at the level of religions as we have them. But it is really based simply a question of there is no other way. That to think that you can keep religion out of politics is an illusion. And I will be happy to hear what you think. You can't, because how can you control how people vote the way they do? And it is undemocratic to try to do that anyway. But even if you can do it, are you going to go into voting booths with people to say, oh no, you can't vote for this guy unless you have rational, objective reasons for doing so? Not because you like his religious attitudes or his moral attitude on some questions because you think that religion says so. So it is dealing with a complex problem, but maybe that's why we need something like this initiative to start untangling these problems for us. Already, I think I referred to this, so I can briefly recall it here, that the paradox of inclusion and exclusion. That's a problem with religions, all religions. Because I wouldn't be a Muslim unless I believed at some level that Islam is better than Christianity and other competing religions. How can I do that and still maintain a level of respect for the human dignity of a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or an atheist? But still, that's what I have to do. So we have a problem here, too. Honestly, we cannot, because somehow our historical experience with religion has been so far that my religion is better because than yours, therefore that's why I'm of this religion and you are of that religion. And of course, what used to follow is that therefore you are a lesser human being, therefore you are someone I should colonize and this and that. But to argue that we shouldn't do that and still maintain the integrity of our religious belief is a challenge that religions, as we know them at this point, have not really been successful in doing. Now, there is this problem of boundaries also. Because the boundaries are not, because when you have that type of attitude of inclusion and exclusion, you are looking for someone who is of a moral caliber as good as yours to accept as your equal. And you are looking at someone else who does not share that to be less of a moral equal to you. That is sort of, again, a runaway problem, because it is not only about separating Hindus from Muslims, but within Muslims, separating those who are truly Muslims and those who are not truly Muslim. To give a quick example, for example, the question, I think it was mentioned this morning with our speaker from Egypt, Ahmed, that, so yes, you have to be a Muslim to measure up to what I expect a true citizen to be. But if you are a Shi'i, then you are not really a good Muslim. If you are a heretic Muslim like me, then you are not really a good Muslim. So the boundary making is growing constantly, and it is in the nature of religious piety and religious belief to reinforce that. We have to find a way to combat that. I have to be also to move on because I know my thing will be up soon. I think that when we come to talk about religion also, that I think that human societies have been, as we did with human rights. What we did with human rights, because we raised the challenge, and then because we can't meet it, we reduced it to the level that we already are at. So we say that there should be the right of universally of every human being equally, but when we can't really do that, then we tend to say that there are the rights that I decide are human rights, and therefore I'm the one who can judge who is and who is not up to bar with that, and so on. With religion too, because we can't live up to the true measure of every religion as conceived by its founder, we tend to reduce the challenge from the golden rule level, from the social justice level, because every founder of a religion was a heretic and was a subversive person of the first magnitude. Jesus was a heretic and a subversive. Muhammad was a heretic and a subversive, to the pre-existing order, of course. And so the point is that every orthodoxy starts as a heresy. Not every heresy becomes an orthodoxy. But there is no orthodoxy that was not a heresy as its point of beginning. So if we claim to adhere, and I think this point was made very powerfully this morning about Jesus, and the question is that who was Jesus, what was Jesus like? He was definitely a radical, subversive heretic who challenged his own community and challenged everybody else, and undermined political authority and moral, religious authority within his community as well as outside. And that was the case with Muhammad too, and I think would be the case with every religious personality that we can find in other traditions. So the point, therefore, is that the true religion is of that founder, not the sort of tamed, essentialized, ritualistic, informal, unchallenging version that we made of it so that we can feel comfortable with it. That was the point I was making about how we tend to reduce the standard of our religion so that we can be comfortable with the level of our being, which is not really what that religion was supposed to achieve for us. But of course, I mean, there's always the question of the human understanding of the believer themselves. That's why at this point I would shift to say that we should not talk about religion, but about specific religions, and not about those, but about believers rather than the religion as such. So we should talk about Muslims, not Islam, about Christians, not Christianity, about Jews, not Judaism, about Hindus, not Hinduism. Because the problem is that for every religion, the nature and quality and reach and transformative power of that religion is how believers understand it. It is not Islam in the abstract. Islam as understood by Muslims and practiced by Muslims. So when you come to tell me that there is an Islam that Muslims don't know and practice, to me that is irrelevant. What concerns me is the Islam that Muslims believe and act upon, and with other traditions equally. So when we do that, we understand why that I shouldn't talk about Islam is peaceful, Islam is sort of this and that. Because it may be, but Muslims are not, and have not been historically throughout their history. So I need to talk about that level, not the level of Islam is this, Islam is that. And whenever anybody comes and say that Islam is this, I say with all due respect, you should say, my understanding of Islam is this. Because it is never other than someone's understanding of it. as far as human experience is concerned. There is a verse in the Quran that says that the Quran is revealed for you in Arabic so that you can understand. But the essence of the Quran is with God beyond human comprehension. So there is a transcendental dimension of Islam. I accept that. But to me, in human experience, what I am concerned with is the level of Islam that Muslims understand and practice. That is the Islam I need to change, or as a Muslim, that is, I'm speaking here, rather than the transcendental dimension, which I cannot comprehend anyway. And by the way, that's why I say Sharia is not divine, because any level of the divine that enters into human comprehension is already limited by the human experience of the person who's comprehending it. So it cannot remain divine and enter into my life and influence the way I behave and think and so on. So that's why it is important to focus on concretely Muslims rather than Islam abstraction. And then when we talk about Muslims, then we are talking about history. Who are the people? Where did they come from? What happened? How did Islam come to this region? How did they practice it historically and so on? But also, how about their post-colonial experience or their colonial experience, post-colonial experience, so that it is not simply, boom, Islam from the Prophet to 21st century. The Prophet did this, I do this because he did that 1,500 years ago. A lot has happened in between. And we are today a product. So when Muslims often say that the Quran tells us do this, do that. Actually, the Quran is telling you maybe individually, but as soon as you talk collectively, you are no longer the collectivity that the Quran was addressing. So much has happened. And so we are not the Muslims communities of Arabia or anywhere else all this time, and so on. So those are some of the complexities. Yes, we have to think of the history of the context of the human experience of people. And so we talk about Muslims, not Islam, but Muslims as in their diversity and sort of very, very different varieties and so on. Okay, so I think I have given enough problems, and where am I? I don't know, I haven't seen a sign. Okay. Wow, at that point. Okay. I get the wrap up. I didn't see the others. They came up, but I was so involved in what I was saying. Very, 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 very quickly, wrap up mode. My solution is, as a Muslim, that we have to separate Islam from the state. In fact, we don't have to do it. It has always been done. It's just that we lost understanding of the fact that it is the case. My argument, and that's why I have to plug in my book since I can't say it. I have a book called Islam and the Secular State, which came out in 2000, Islam and the Secular State, 2008. And in that book, I make this argument, and to show that there was never an Islamic state at any point in Muslim history. The state was always a political institution. People come and say, but how about the Prophet? The Prophet's experience in Medina was too exceptional to be relevant, because he was the Prophet. And unless you have another Prophet, every other human being who tries to set up an Islamic state will be setting up his or her own imaginary and understanding of what that state is. But never the Islamic state as the Prophet himself may have done it, because he was receiving a revelation until the day he died. There is no other human being who can. So what Muhammad said was Islam. What everybody else says is that person's view of Islam. So there has never been an Islamic state. Second point, Sharia cannot, not that it should not, but cannot be enforced by the state. A norm of Sharia ceases to be Sharia by the very act of enacting it as a state law. It becomes the political will of the state, not the religious law of Muslims. So that when I comply, I'm complying because the state said so, not because my conviction is that way. And therefore my compliance does not count. It has no religious value. Because to have religious value, it has to be voluntary and by conviction. I have to have the intent to comply. For those who know the term, it's called niyyah. I have to have the intent, a specific intent to comply. If I don't, then my act is, if I happen to miss meals and water for a whole day, I'm not fasting unless I had intended to fast the day before. That's a very simple example to make it. So that we have to do that. We have to understand that there is no such thing as an Islamic state. There is no possibility of enforcement of Sharia by the state. So the idea that, where did this talk come from? It is a post-colonial discourse. Meaning that, and you can check it out, now you can do everything online. You will not find the term Islamic State anywhere in any language before the 20th century. And you will not find in Muslim history any examples of state enforcement of Sharia. In the sense of the post-colonial state, which is the nation hierarchical, bureaucratic, coercive, all-encompassing state that we have today. So it is the post-colonial state and its post-colonial version of positive law that people are talking about when they talk about an Islamic state and enforcement of Sharia. But that is colonial. So the talk about an Islamic state and enforcement of Sharia is the least Islamic of all discourses. It is a post-colonial discourse dictated by colonial concepts and ideas and institutions. The final bit, which is the easiest part, is we have to regulate Islam and politics connection so that we don't allow the state. I was joking when I said the easiest. So that we can't have sort of confusion between, or rather manipulation of Islam in politics that undermines the separation of Islam and the state. I really have to wrap up, and I abide by the rule, and I hope I have delivered on some of the complex tasks I promised to talk about. Thank you very much.